Hello, everyone. This is Jeffrey Tefertiller back with another Service Management Leadership Podcast. Got a great guest for you this week, Alex Fullick. Alex is a business continuity pro. And so he has his own podcast on the topic. I thought this would be a great segue from service management, business continuity. Alex, how are you today?
I'm doing good, Jeffrey. How are you?
I am awesome. We were talking before off the air that I'm just now coming out of COVID and I have my energy back, and I'm like, and it's awesome. It's awesome after being dull for so long.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you're doing better. That's the main thing.
Thank you, and me too. So you get calls being in your line of work. I do business continuity, program, documentation, all that stuff, just like you do. And so you get calls, right? And when you get a call and a company says, hey, we need some help. We need some help getting our act together to get our stuff in order. What is your high level process as you start that engagement?
Well, I've got a few things that I always want to know right off the bat. One, why am I there? Am I there to rebrand a program, pick it up, and fix something? Am I there just to do a test? Am I there to do an audit? Why am I there? I can't assume that because I've been brought on board, I have to go all the way back to the beginning and do a BIA. You can't make that assumption. And depending on who I'm reporting to, hopefully it's someone higher up, a vice president or someone, ask them, what are your expectations? What are you wanting to see when I'm finished, when I hand it over to somebody else, or, what's important to you? Because that tells me, I'm going to get hate mail for this, but that'll tell me whether I need to even focus on a BIA.
Right.
If they already have some expectations, this is what we need, this is what's important to us, then that's giving me a starting point, right? And I also want to know, is there anything already in existence? Do you have a BCP plan? Do you have a crisis management plan? What do you have? So I can go through my own mental checklist. Okay, we've got this, we don't have that, take a look at it and find out, okay, yeah, we can leverage this. We need to reformat it a little bit, or, oh, there's a 700-page binder, isn't that nice? Maybe we should trim this down a bit. It gives me an idea of where I am, right? Because I think if I'm brought on board, I need to understand where they are. I do have to learn about their business and what they do, but I need to understand my starting point and where they are right then and there. They could have already had I could be brought on board because they've had an audit, and audit has pointed something out that there's a big gap. So I need to understand what that gap is, why they have that gap, why audit has even said it's a gap, because maybe it's not, it could be addressed somewhere else. And, if they've had a recent incident, disaster or crisis, that, what we had is lacking. So here's what we had, we need to take some lessons learned, and we need to get things, fixed, because lessons learned, I'm a firm believer, if nothing changes, then you haven't learned anything. Lessons learned has to equal a change somewhere, a process, a document, whatever the case may be. So that's my process. Once I know all of that, then I can determine what my next steps are going to be. I have to do my own little self-assessment, my own little checklist. And then I can develop the process. Okay, this is what's going on here. Now I know what I can do to fix that.
So let me repeat what I heard. You want to know, what's my problem statement? What is it we're trying to solve? What deliverables do I need to produce? What's the output? And then what are the drivers? What's making this thing tick? Why?
Yeah.
What's pushing this along? And I don't know if I don't think you and I've talked, but I don't think I told you this story, and you're going to get a chuckle. One of the first engagements I did with this many years ago, I said, what do you all have? And this was the finance group. they go to a file cabinet, they pull out a big cheap tablet, a pencil, a calculator, and a handwritten sheet with all of their account numbers with passwords. And I was like,
Okay.
and they did that during like the bird flu or something, way back when. I was like, well, we have some work to do here. And because what do? Last thing I would ever want somebody to do is go put all their, and this is a very public company. Last thing they'd want to do is put their count numbers out there, right? And anyway, I say that story only because it's there. Every organization's having to go through at least this mental process of what's happened. The one thing I wanted to bring up and I wanted to push in a little bit, you brought up the point that if whatever we learn, we have to reincorporate it. And we'll get into the COVID implications, but it amazes me, it astounds me that in the last 12 months, if an organization's business continuity documentation, let's just say as a whole, hasn't been impacted by what's happened in the last 12 months,
Yeah.
they may have bigger problems. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I can guarantee this is what's going to happen. None of that documentation will get updated, or there won't be some sort of a lessons learned session, for months yet.
Right.
And then they'll only remember the most recent things. And lessons learned, I think, should be continuous, always going on, capturing little things, oh, we need to look at this, we need to change this. This what went well, let's keep doing it. This what didn't go well, let's change it. This is what we forgot about, we need to add. This didn't work, but don't remove the stuff that didn't work, because it doesn't mean it's not going to work in the next situation, right? Mm-hmm. So a lessons learned, as far as I'm concerned, should always be something that's ongoing. And if something doesn't change at the end, because maybe by the time you get to the end, the players have changed.
Right.
If it's a project of some sort, you're only there for a project, people will have left, assigned to something else. They could be contractors, they've left. People have changed their position in the organization, so many reasons, and all that knowledge and some of those lessons they learned went out the door with them. Yes. Or to the new position or whatever, and then try to get them back. And it's like, well, I can't remember. So it's got to be ongoing, as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, yes. And you bring up the point that, and you mentioned contractors. I would say even the length of tenure within organizations is shortening. And you cannot guarantee that you had leadership support last year that you have it this year, because now new regimes come into play, or whatever it is. So we all have different styles and methods. And one of the things I really like about business continuity is there's no, this is the way you should do it. Now there's many, this is the way we have done it, or this is the way we used to do it, but there's no like prescription. Take two of these and call me in the morning prescription. I work off of one that I developed, and I found many people in the community have their own process. How did you develop your process for working through the business continuity program documentation? I say documentation, lack of a better word, through that process.
Well, it's been a lot of trial and error. Because when I started way back, about 23 years ago, I instantly went straight to a couple of the larger institutes that promoted business continuity and followed, thou shalt follow this roadmap. And when I started doing that, it was fine. I learned it. But as I did more and more of it, I found, well, wait a minute, this doesn't always work everywhere. And I've had to amend the way I do something like a BIA, for an example, because I found that, I'm collecting all this information, all this data, and yet all I'm ending up with at the end of the day is a list of critical processes that I said, like I mentioned at the beginning, one of the things, the expectations of executives is to often doesn't align. It's like,
Yes.
it's like users saying, this is what's important to the company. This is what thou shalt do. Well, it's executives who set the priorities for the organization. It's them who tell, the rest of the business, this is where we're going. This is what we're doing. And a lot of times the two never mix. And I actually had that happen to me way back in, I think, 2010 or something. I think I've mentioned it on my show before, but I was sitting with the CFO, who was my sponsor, and I gave him the first draft of the BIA, which we did. It was a government agency, so there was no way of getting out of doing a BIA. You had to do it, period, like it or not. So I gave him the first draft and showed him, all the items that everyone said was important and had to be up and running, in 0 hours or 4 hours or whatever. And he looked at it, and this is a quote, I'll never forget it. "This is embarrassing." And I'll tell you, my face went red and, cold sweat, like, oh my God, what did I do wrong? I've been doing hundreds of BIAs. I know what I'm doing. What's going on? And he said that everything that he and the rest of the C-suite, the people that sit around that boardroom table, have their list of priorities, and very little of it showed up in that critical process list. And he said, we haven't done a good job of communicating our priorities because you've just identified what the rest of the company thinks is important, and it's not in line with us. So that's why your first question, I said, finding out those priorities, so along the way, I've changed how to do that, and you mentioned documentation, and you gave an example about some of the documentation you've come across. And I mentioned the 700 pager. Well, my very first, when I became a contractor consultant, the very first place I went to, they had a big blue binder, with hundreds of pages in it. And they had just went through an incident not 2 weeks before I got there. But that wasn't the reason why I was there. Oddly enough, it was just the timing. And I asked, I said, well, how did the binder do? Because I thought maybe I could leverage some of this, and they said, well, I can't tell you the words they really used, but it didn't do them any good, and so I've also gotten to the point where I take out a lot of the fluff stuff now, document audience, who's got a copy, well, all that stuff you see it, in an executive summary pages that sometimes goes on for like, 10, 12 pages. Nobody reads it. Nobody needs it. If you're writing a business continuity plan or a crisis management plan, it's got to be for those that are using it, user focused, action based, give them a list of decisions to make that need to be made, or things to review or look at, whatever, but not, oh, here's who's got a copy. Here's how we test it. Here's the approach we use to document this. You don't need all of that. In saying that, because I know if anyone in audit and compliant just heard me say that, they're probably freaking out right now. What I do is I do keep that information, but I put it in a consolidated program overview document now. So if you've got an emergency management, crisis management, business continuity, BIAs, testing, all that stuff, each has a section in that document that says, what the latest version is, when it was tested, what got updated. So it's one consolidated document. I've taken it out. And the reason I do that is because the key reason is users didn't like it, and it meant nothing to them. So from my own experience dealing with users and people who have to use those plans, get rid of the stuff they don't need. So that my approach keeps changing, as the industry changes. COVID obviously is going to change the way we do things, and how we look at things. I don't think we can stick to a single approach over and over again and have it work, for everybody. I had a response on LinkedIn to something a while back, and someone didn't agree with what I was saying, that I may not do a BIA or a risk analysis or whatever the same way as some of these governing bodies say. You have to follow what they say, But then they also turned around and agreed and said that, but you're right, and not everything works for everyone. Well, if it doesn't work for anyone, obviously I got to change the way I'm doing it. And it goes back to meeting the client, and what they need. If what you do for a pharmaceutical may be different for a manufacturer, which may be different for a bank or a government agency. So we can't say one size fits all, because if one size fit all, we'd all be driving black Model Ts.
Exactly.
So
And,
it continues to evolve.
oh yes, and on that point, what's really interesting is when you mentioned that story and your CFO sponsor was different than what they thought versus what the others. I had two thoughts on that. One is wherever the executives are, whatever is important to them is where the money goes in the staffing, which is very interesting because when you have that disconnect, it's a true disconnect. But second of all, that's also why whenever I'm doing business continuity, I always think of a bottom up. Like if it's the group, whatever group, right? Retail, and the people, I want them to have something actionable. And to your point about keeping it as simple as possible, if they're holding it in their hands, and I take the opposite side of that fat binder because it has to be actionable. I live in the Midwest of the US, so we have tornadoes. Tornadoes coming, what do I need to do? Power's off, what do I need to do? And because the top-down approach to what you were saying is all that's doing is identifying what are the important business processes and what are some of the high level. But
yeah,
the purpose of business continuity planning is so that these individual groups know what they need to do and can execute. Is that oversimplifying it?
No, I agree with you. And when I am building those and documenting those continuity plans, I include those people. They're the one, they understand what they're going to need to do. I just need to get it out of their heads at a high level and put it on paper. They know it. They know what they need to do when they start talking and, and bouncing ideas off each other or whiteboarding, whatever it is they're doing. They know, it's not me to tell them this is how you are going to run your company if you have a situation or a crisis. They know for the most part. They just need to be empowered, listened to, and to be able to capture all those different thoughts and put it on paper, and or an application, whatever you're using, and capture it. And that's part of my role is to facilitate. So that happens.
I'm right there with you in terms of role of facilitator. I'm like, this is your plan. If something happens, they're not going to call me. Yeah. They're not going to remember the tall, ugly guy with glasses with the long last name. They're not going to remember me. They're going to say, where's my plan and can I execute it? That's all that matters.
Yep, I agree.
All right, so let's dive a little deeper, if we may. What is the purpose of a BIA? You've mentioned it. You mentioned that, hey, it's sometimes included, and I get what you're saying, because some regulatory bodies, there's the thou shouts, right?
Yeah.
And others, hey, we're doing this for best practice for our unique organization. Some of them are, we just want to be able to remain continuous during an impactful event. Others have the regulatory. And every regulatory body I know, going from NIST and NERC and FEMA and all those others, BIAs, Johnny on the spot at the starting line, right? And so what's the purpose of a BIA, business impact analysis, for those of you that don't know, and what should be included in it?
I guess I should toe the party line for at least 1 minute. No, I can skip it. Good. It's supposed to show, obviously, all your processes and put them in priority order so that if you have a disaster situation, all the dependencies, the processes need to be up, when they need to be up and running, the recovery time objectives, blah, 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 blah. I don't like to talk about that too much because I get frustrated and flustered with it, because it doesn't, all it ends up being, it becomes a big asset management exercise of knowing how many computers there are, how many people there are, and where they're located. You're doing an assessment of the business or the company rather than the key word that never seems to get addressed by a BIA is the I part, the impact. It never seems to come out properly, and it frustrates me because the BIA, when you have all these processes, and I already gave the example where it didn't align with the CFOs, or the rest of the C-suite, I should say, their priorities. And you end up having to also determine all these recovery times. But for the most part, these recovery times are guessed at by people.
Right.
Because you can have floods that don't impact you. You can have floods that impact your workers because they can't get across the river to your facility, but your facility is untouched, but you still go through the same, well, what's the probability of a flood and what's the impact on us? Well, you only get one choice, one answer, moderate, or low, but then something else could happen. Sprinklers could go off and your building floods. So I'm finding that recovery times and some of this other information that the BIA provides doesn't seem to be accurate anymore. It may have been great when we all had Y2K coming. Excuse me. When the BIA, was first introduced way back, before Y2K, we all had the same situation, the same timeframes to deal with, the same scenarios to deal with. But we're beyond that now. We're 21 years beyond that, and different things are happening. Now you've got COVID. We've mentioned COVID, which started out as a people disaster. People were getting sick and and worse. That spread to facilities being unavailable, but yet facilities really were available. Just people couldn't go there. Local governments either put people in lockdown. So people were available, systems were available. Facilities were available, but people weren't in them. They were told, mandated, in some cases, you got to stay and work at home, which was a whole new set of things people need to look at that a BIA never captured. Nobody looked at the recovery time objectives. I don't know if you saw on LinkedIn a week or two ago, I wish I could remember the gentleman's name. There was an informal poll done as to, what did your organization look at, when you were told to work from home and when COVID first came into, impacting everybody. And there were a few choices, work at home capabilities and a few other things. The one that got the least views was BIAs.
Yes.
That got the least amount of votes. Nobody was looking at the BIA because it didn't matter. 4 hours. Well, what, by the time you tell everyone to go home, within 4 hours, they're all at home, everything's hunky-dory, bunnies and rainbows, everybody's logged in and working happily, just in 4 hours? No, that's not the way things worked. And then you've got the cyber and ransomware. Well, there's been instances, articles that have already been out and it's been on the news. Companies are down for, not just 4 hours to get their data, but days and weeks. And I remember talking to somebody who said they had a client that was a couple of weeks before they found a backup that wasn't corrupted. So where's your 4 hours then? Right. You've lost all that data before. What's the business doing? You got to recreate it, the recovery times. And those are the two key things impacting organizations right now. And RTOs don't mean a thing. Recovery points didn't mean a thing in ransomware, and maximum acceptable outage. Well, you're going to have an earthquake. You've got casualties. Hopefully not casualties. Employees or employees' families. But after 4 hours, you're still expected to be up and running. That's not realistic. Right. And I'm finding that over time, the BIA no longer seems to hold the information we need from it. It's not providing what we need anymore. It may have done a long time ago, but it's not now. The world has changed, and yet the BIA hasn't. Or the way we do it. Same thing with the risk assessment. On the other side of it, I mentioned, the risk. We look at various scenarios, your people, places, and things, which are the three terms I use, like the old Wheel of Fortune categories. That's why I use them. They're easy to remember. And it so looks at scenarios, and I mentioned floods. We look at a flood. What's the probability? Well, did we ever look at a pandemic? What's the probability of a pandemic? Well, hopefully low. What's the impact? Well, hopefully low. Well, it turned out to be really high.
Yes.
And it's still happening, and in some places it is still high, and yet people, places, and things are all available. So there's so much focus on different scenarios with the risk assessment, and that carries over into the BIA, or if you do the BIA first, whichever way, they carry over into each other, and they're not providing the information that we really need anymore. I think the what is it, impact times probability equals risk exposure. I don't think that works in everything anymore. And it's interesting because those conversations are now happening. You're seeing more and more people saying, what, you're right. That old way of thinking, our world has changed, business has changed, the way we do our business changed, and so I forgot what the original question was.
Oh, it's good. You got it. And we'll go back up to the BIA and then come back to the risk assessment.
Okay.
Couple of things that really struck me, and you alluded to it, but I'm layering in my experience. The business impact analysis usually talks about internal dependencies on other departments, like IT, facilities, whatever, and external. But very few organizations put the focus, if they're really, you use the word the impact, on that external vendors. Think about how many IT orgs are using cloud. They're well over 50% of their infrastructure is cloud. How many have outsourced data centers, or let me keep going, outside or facilities maintenance in your offices, or outsourced whatever it is? That has to be included in your BIA to even have a dream of being somewhat accurate. Mm-hmm. You mentioned three terms, and I want us to just take a little bit of a dive down. So we have RPOs, which is the amount of data you can lose. Really, how much do you need to back up? Because that's all that you can lose. Some organizations, they take a snapshot every 24 hours. So they say my RPO is 24 hours. RTO is how much time can you be down, right? And usually your maximum allowable outage or downtime is some arbitrary number that they say we can only be down X. Now here's two questions, and these are not loaded at all, hopefully. Can those three be the same amount? And which, if not, if it's your experience, which one of those is usually the highest, the longest, time period, and which one's the lowest?
Oh, well, different places have said different things. Usually the RTO and the MAO, the MAO, yeah, usually end up being the same. Those two end up being the same, because RTO means you're down already. So if you're saying, we have to be up and running 4 hours, I'll just say 4 hours, then that's the maximum acceptable outage time as well. Right? So they end up being the same for the most part. There may be differences, but for the most part, they're the same. Sometimes the MAO comes into play when you're talking about a bigger, wider scale, disaster, and so sometimes it could be, well, if it's an earthquake, our systems, as long as we can get some of our systems up in 4 hours, we're fine, but the rest can be down for a day. So sometimes that comes into play there. Recovery point, well, we are so system driven these days with data, that I've seen over the years that number has shrunk drastically. Yes. It's almost, we can't lose any data. Well, what are you going to do if you have a ransomware attack? You are going to lose data. You could lose days, like I said before, days, weeks, or months even. So I've seen that number almost come to zero. We can't lose anything because everything is so system driven. There isn't any more paper files to refer back to, and say, okay, well, here's the application. Oh yeah, here's all the user information. We can just retype this. Well, sometimes you can't do that now. You have to, you mentioned dependencies. If you've got a dependency, then you're reaching out to your other suppliers and clients or financial institutions and saying, please, can you tell us what we sent you? Or what did you send us in the last 24 hours? To try and start recreating. So the first and the RTO and the MAU I found have drastically come down, and sometimes they are the same number, but our RPO has virtually become zero now, because there's so much data. Data, is considered like a currency now.
And it's interesting. You said people, places, things. I go off of the who, the people, the where, the locations, and some organizations are location specific. And I think of technology, but lately, and I ask you how you've evolved. One of the ways that at least my thought process and how I weave it in is the data, because I have to be able. 20 years ago, we worried about what files do we need to keep, hard copy files. What files do we need?
Operation manuals.
Oh yeah, what supplies do we need to get? Now it's what data do I need to make sure is available and I can get to it. Yeah. Even if it's not separated, it still has to be in the back of our mind, because think of a bank. A bank has to be able to know your account balance at any one given time, or they have exposure like none other, and I just think of that data, because some organizations, they are being driven by their data, whether they want to or not. And it may be the most valuable thing. We think of the stories like Facebook tracking people. Why? Because of data. We think of data. So you mentioned risk assessment. So business impact.
Can I just say something back to the people, places? The people's I also look at not just your employees, but for your crisis management team as well. Who's available? Who's not available? Who can help set things up? If you're recovering and you're gone to another site, let's say, what people are available. Data analysts or something, or data entry are available to either log in from home or travel somewhere, to continue operations. Places isn't just your headquarters, but it could be data centers, it could be regional offices. Now with COVID, it could also be people's homes.
Yes.
That is one of your facilities. People might not like hearing that, but it really is, because if you've only got one person performing a function and they're at home and they have a power outage, well, then that function is not going to happen, until that person gets their power up and running again. And things, I do include, data, well, anything that's not a person or a place, data, systems, network, applications, all that kind of stuff. Sorry, now on to risk assessment.
Right. So let's summarize. BIA, business impact analysis, basically tells you your core business processes. These are what we deliver to our customers, X, Y, Z, their dependencies. And I usually have some supporting processes for the others, because I want to take it down one level. That's just my view of the world. And it has a maximum allowable outage, downtime, whichever word you want to use, RPOs, RTOs, and it looks at what's the minimum amount of people and technology that we need to keep this function going. All right.
But then that's just at a best guess too, because the disaster itself is going to dictate could change all of those numbers that you've got.
Exactly. But that's the BIA. Yep. So now the risk assessment, of which I usually do the second piece, it basically says, okay, for each of your core business processes that you all have defined, and everybody that does a risk assessment has this big long list of possible types of events, right?
Yeah.
Everything from like if you're a bank, a bank robbery to a power outage to no internet to whatever it is, right? Technology being down, whatever it is. And you scale those by probability times impact, basically.
Mhm.
And I found that the risk assessment's pretty straightforward, except nobody agrees on the on the probability and the impact. Because I've been married for almost 20 years, 20 years next month. And
Congratulations.
oh, it's more congratulations to her to put up with me. But that's a different story. Uh, but we just don't look at the world the same, right?
Mhm.
Like the probability somebody's a optimist, the other one's a, let's call it realist, right? Or pessimist. And so, getting all that to congeal on a risk assessment is kind of fun. Just because you say, well, you get them in a room, I'm sure that's what you do, right? You say,
Mhm.
hey, what's the chances of a power outage? Because the reason it's important on a risk assessment, and this is the question to you, is because even though it sounds like a statement, it impacts how resources are spent. And my anecdote to set up your question was I was meeting with a public utility, and if you think of a public utility, when the power's out, that's when they get all the calls, right? Because somebody's like, when's my power coming on? Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Their thought was if we have a power outage for our people taking calls, we'll send them home. And I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. What happens if they don't have power? And but if that's, you have to think, is that a high probability where now we have to worry about having another location that's ready to go or not? It's those kind of decisions.
Well, it's true because right now, if you uh, we'll use power outages or where I am, I'm an hour west of Toronto. If there's a big snowstorm, there's a lot of people out here that commute into Toronto to work. Yeah, well, they're all working from home now, but if there's a big snowstorm, we lose our power, then there's a big chunk of workforce that's not able to do anything. So depending on when you're asking that question, what's the probability, what's the impact or probability of a power outage? It's going to be different depending on what's happening, what you're going through. And you mentioned, people in a room, somebody could say, well, it's pretty low. Someone could say, well, it happens more than you think. And then someone else could turn around and say, yeah, but we have a backup generator that kicks in, within 5 seconds. So whether there's a power outage or not, whoopee-doo. So you
And
get 3 different answers.
right. And mine was, if it's really that big of a deal, maybe you find a hotel and a meeting room and you give them a retainer and that's your plan, right? And but you have to, that risk assessment, which gets glossed over, and if nobody agrees, drives investment because you are saying these are the ones that we have to address. Here's the question, and I'll try to form it as a question. The Do you feel like that the items that are the highest of your risk score for risk assessments, that should somehow, directly or indirectly, be reflected in your business continuity plans as we need to be able to handle these types of events?
Well, I still look at it as people, places, and things, depending on where that risk falls in. Is it a people risk, a facility risk, or a things risk? And then aligning that into your continuity plans, which should address people, places, and things. So if you've got 3 high people risks, well, then you've got to look in your continuity plans that address people availability risks, you know, and because of COVID, facility, and other things and cyber attacks. So what comes out of your risk? Yeah, sometimes does, depending on what it is. Sometimes there's some bizarre ones that come out there that you just have to accept, and but other ones, yeah, they do have to show some sort of reflection into your continuity plans. If you've got a high probability of losing a facility due to a flood, well, then you want to make sure that in your continuity plans you've got contact information for people who can fix that information. You've worked with local authorities, and civil response, and different technology vendors, so that you can get something up and running somewhere else or send people tell people stay where they are, don't come here. So yeah, out of risk, it does come into your contingency plans, and you can put the right mitigation factors that you need to in them.
Yeah, I was thinking like here, I mentioned I live in a place where there's tornadoes, right? If tornadoes score high, and depending on which month of the year you ask, it'll score differently, right? And because there's just a month or two that's big season of tornadoes. But if it's tornadoes are high, then you think, okay, how do we, because that could be a people, places, and things.
Mhm.
But then, even like, how do we get physical security out there quickly enough? Who talks to the media? All those sort of things that trickle down that are very important. The other thing on the people aspect for the BIA that just struck me when you mentioned, hey, these analysts, do we have the right people at the new location? One of the biggest things that I have found, especially as we make that path towards business continuity plans, is making sure we have the primary, the secondary, and even a third person who is in charge of your calling the shots for the business continuity plans, right?
Mhm.
You know
Yeah.
what I'm saying? You have to, you have to have somebody that says, okay, we're ready to go. We're gonna enact our business continuity plans, right?
The one thing I do want to add, because you're talking about people as well and the listing of who can do what, when you're doing the BIA, you got to be careful not to dig too deep on the activity level,
Right.
because I've experienced it where people have thought you are actually evaluating their role.
Oh, yes.
And I actually had a manager, and at the time I was still kind of relatively new, so it seemed like a great idea. When we finish this BIA, we're going to have all this information, and we can map back, where the company's spending money, and find out, who's doing what. And it seemed all great until I actually went back to my desk and started, putting notes together, and went, oh my God, it seems like I'm evaluating people's roles, and it's happened. I've heard some horror stories, so you got to be careful of how deep you go in a BIA, and the risk, to that level too, when you're starting to talk about people who can do what, who can't do what. Sometimes it can come across as really negative, and if you've done that, it's really hard to get them back,
Right.
get them back on your side.
Oh, yes. And even on that, you have to worry about one person filling a bunch of roles that now you have to reevaluate and unravel that a little bit more. Because especially in the small and medium sized companies, there are some strategic people who've been there a long time that know where the figurative bodies are buried. And so,
Yeah, yeah. I've worked with a few people like that. You're like, oh my God, how do you know all this?
oh, and they love being that person. Whoever,
Yeah,
they love being that person. And more power to them, because I love you loving being that person. And so most of the process is we have a BIA, it feeds a risk assessment, which helps us build our business continuity plans. And we then build these business continuity plans. Everybody signs off, gives their A-OK, and then we test the plans. And the testing is, people look at it full of anxiety. And I look at it as a GPS moment. Where are we? You wherever you are, and you see this map, and it says you are here. That's how I see these testing. Is it shows us where we're at. So, what's your preferred method of testing? What's your thought process of testing those business continuity plans?
Well, I did want to just comment on the anxiety with tests, because we've all gone through grade school or high school when you had a test, you either passed or failed. If you didn't remember enough, you failed. If you remembered a lot, you passed. That's carried on into adulthood. We still have that. Test is a 4-letter word. So it's never seen as something positive. So I tend to try it now and use the word exercise, though sometimes I still flip into test mode, but exercise a plan. But as for a preferred approach, one, it depends on where the organization is. Again, if they've got a relatively mature program, well, then I'm not just going to do a walkthrough or a tabletop. We're going to do something a little more in depth, challenge them, know what they know how to do, find out what they know how to do, and challenge it, make it better. If they are relatively new, they haven't done any exercising before, well, I'm not going to throw them, off a cliff. That wouldn't be fair. Get them talking in a room and do a walkthrough, and try to get some challenges going with that as well. What I tend to try and get people to do is get them involved and find out, okay, if this is what you're doing, how would you really do it? Did we capture everything that's in these plans? No, I have to call Bob, or Sally first. Ooh, that's a big gap, and finding that gap, some people will think, oh my God, I've done something wrong, and I look at it, no, if we found these gaps now, under quote controlled circumstances, that's fantastic. I'd rather find lots and lots and lots of gaps, and have lots of questions brought up, and everybody talking, than tell everyone, oh, well, you guys suck. I don't want to do that. So I want to make it more of a positive experience. I know executives, and I've worked with executives, they will say, well, you guys found all these issues, the test of failure. It's like, no, it's not. If that was a real situation, you came across those issues, then what? Stumble on their words. So I tried to find out again where they are and then develop the approach. I don't have any preferred method. What I will do all the time, though, is try and challenge, people. If they say, our plans are great, we've done walkthroughs, great. Well, then we're going to do a simulation, and then I'm going to take their plan and go, okay, well, let's see, and find a way to challenge it, to push the envelope, so to speak, so that, they find more things, get them thinking more and participating more rather than just following a script, because then it just goes back to what you were doing in school. I'm just remembering a script and that's all. That's not going to help. You got to get people engaged and involved and challenge them a little bit to make things better, because some of the things that come out of it, the gaps you identify, they're already going to have ideas for, oh, if we encounter this, if we can do X, Y, and Z, well, great, let's capture that. That's a great finding. So, I don't really have a preferred approach, to really answer the question.
Well, to me, when you mentioned the exercise finding gaps, my parents used to say some lessons are more expensive than others. I see these as cheap lessons versus being under the gun. I also see two, let's call them critical success factors of your testing exercise. One is communication. If however you test, one of the deciding factors of whether that test or reality exercise is successful, how well do you communicate? Can you get a hold of everyone? Can your leader be on the ball quickly enough and call the shots, right?
Yeah.
Second of all, which is probably just important, and this is what I brought up at the BIA, but how much vendor involvement do you need during that? I mean, we rely on vendors way more than or whatever word you want to, service providers, whatever word that is. You need to make sure you understand their role in your processes, because I like it, if they're heavily involved in our core processes, I want those vendors at the table when we're testing, because we cannot assume that their people, places, and things are redundant and all that sort of thing. What are your thoughts?
Exactly. And that will come out in, the type of test that you're doing and what your scenario is going to be, because sometimes you're not testing where a vendor needs to get involved, but other times you are. And you need to make sure, to your point, that their systems are up and running, that they know what to do, that you have someone in your organization who calls them.
Yes.
I was in a position years ago where I was the person that picked up the phone to call our disaster recovery vendor and put them on notice. We've got a power outage or something's happened here. So they're on notice and they circle the wagons and they pull all their people together and they call me back and say, okay, we're ready. We've got your plan here. What's the next step? And I get them on the calls that need to happen. So if I wasn't there, okay, my backup better know who to talk to, and where that plan is and who the number for that person and who they need to call and what our client number was, and you bring all that in. And while I'm saying this, I just remembered an example from a tabletop walkthrough I did a long time ago. I got there half hour early in the room and it was set up, and it wasn't going to be anything super challenging because it was the very first time ever this company would have been going through this. So it was more of a walkthrough. But I thought I'd still start it off with an interesting little piece. And the first person walked into the room, I gave them an envelope. And I said, you can read that envelope, but you can't share it with anybody until, I snap our fingers and say, okay, we're now starting our test. And the envelope said, or the message inside said that you just discovered, and I forgot the scenario, but you discovered an issue, blah, blah, blah. You need to escalate it to, your manager, crisis lead, et cetera, et cetera. So everyone got in the room, half hour. And I said, okay, we're starting. And everyone just sat there and nobody moved, including the person with the envelope. And eventually that person said, when are we going to get started? Because it was actually a director who walked in. I said, when are we going to get started? And I looked at my watch. I said, well, you've known about a disaster for almost a half an hour and you haven't told anybody about it. And he pulls out, and he reads it again and goes, oh my God. And then we went through the exercise and did what we needed to do. And at the end, I gave everybody another envelope, red, green, or yellow pieces of paper inside, with red, they were not available, period. And I just asked, based on the color you got, would the decisions you made would they have been able to be made by somebody else, your alternate? And a lot of people turned around, that especially the ones that got red, which was a small percentage, said, I don't know. I really don't know. So, and I said, good. Now we've got lots of work to do. We know where we need to go. So it's always fun to do those kind of things.
Yes. And the interesting thing to me is everybody says, I think our company can handle a failover exercise. But then they want to plan it out. And see, the purpose of a failover or any test is exercise, if you will, is the unknown. But if we do it on a Saturday when nothing's impacted and we fail it over, it looks good, and we fail it back, we may not know of issues until Monday. And it's one of those things that just kind of humor, right?
I worked at a company who used to do that. The failover of this big system they had, it was, their biggest key system, and they would plan for weeks and weeks and weeks this failover. And every single time I would just shake my head going, this isn't realistic at all. You're planning the exercise. You're not exercising any plan. Mind you, there was the amount of risk that came with that was massive. And I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars impact if something had happened. So they were a little bit handcuffed, to having to plan that.
I understand.
Still, it wasn't a true reflection of what might happen.
The other thing I want to mention before we get into a couple of closing topics is I think business continuity should be at least the table, not the forefront, but at least at the table. If you're bringing new functionality into your organization, you must consider your resilience, which I consider a three-legged table of response, business continuity, and recovery, disaster recovery. But if we're bringing new technology on, think about people who are putting in Salesforce as a CRM, as all their customer data, and they're doing it in June. They've already done their business continuity planning earlier in the year. Think about those companies that go 6 months 8 months, 9 months without updating their business continuity plans, documentation, risks. And this has all their customer data. And so I think of all those new functionalities that we bring on as a business, say these are strategic. We have to account for them when we bring them online for business continuity, for disaster recovery, for how we respond to things. What are your thoughts?
I agree. They need to be involved much sooner. And having worked in project and program management for quite a bit, BCM or whatever term the client uses is at the table, especially during kickoff. So they know that, oh, you're replacing this entire system or changing the process, whatever the case may be, and you're expecting to do that in a year. Okay, so then you see what the schedule, a high-level schedule is going to be, and BCM knows right away, if it's January, December, in August, I need to reach out to such and such and start reviewing the continuity plans or crisis management plan or whatever it is and getting it updated. Because I've worked for places that do that, and one of the success criteria to launch is to ensure continuity plans, disaster recovery plans have all been updated, and distributed or whatever they do with them. But that's on the list. So I think they need to. You can't wait to just launch and then just say, okay, well, now we've changed everything. And again, to my point earlier, like lessons learned, a lot of those people have already gone.
Right.
So now you're struggling. Well, what changed?
Exactly.
Who's around to tell me what changed?
But we're in this time of digital transformation, digital disruption, and everything's getting disrupted. Everything's getting transformed. And all I'm saying is it needs to be a proactive thought versus a reactive thought.
Yep.
All right.
I agree.
Last big question for you. And this is a big one. This I ask on every topic. I ask the same question from every guest. How has COVID changed how you do things? You mentioned how the people aspect went from centralized to decentralized. And so that's a layup. But I know there's a lot of deeper ways that it's impacted how you do things.
Well, for one, I was one of those really lucky people whose contract was ended as a result of COVID. So how I do things is rather different because what I'm doing right now is rather different. I'm attending obviously webinars and keeping up to date on the latest happenings and finishing a book and writing an outline for a new one. Had you on the show, and now I'm on your show, taking training and talking to a lot of people. So how COVID has impacted me that way is one thing. But I know from all these things that articles that I'm reading and different ways of learning things, I know I'm going to be taking that into whatever my next client, whoever that is going to be, and taking the lessons learned that I'm reading about and learning about and talking about, and meeting with those clients and saying, okay, well, this is what I've learned from all these other places. What have you got? And changing ways. So COVID, I'm losing a contract or not, I'm not standing still. So it's if I was working for someone, I might have a different answer, but not working for someone, that's my answer right now.
Well, let's take that. It's impacting business continuity. It impacts the places part. We already talked about that because the people have decentralized. It's impacted the things because somebody may have had a desktop with a printer at their office. Now it's remote. Now it's changed, so many things. Even in your software contracts, it's changed because you have to be able to VPN, all that sort of thing. And I would even say, so it's impacted your people, obviously, right?
For me,
because a lot of organizations shed headcount. They have less headcount. People like yourself on contract, even, and your places. Now you have many more times that your things have changed, and so I think it's I think it's going to be indelibly impressed upon our brains. Even when we're out of this, we're still going to remember how it was with COVID. You know, if people go back to the office, because I don't think I work from home, I think I live at work sometimes. And, you know, it's changed a lot of that, don't you think?
It has. You know, I enjoy working from home because I'm an introvert at heart. Unless I'm, you know, on something like this or standing on a stage or something, then I become an extrovert. But as an introvert, I like working from home, less distractions. I'm able to focus on things, you know, and I can get up and walk away, you know, whenever I want. And even when I walk away, I'm not being interrupted. You know, so for me, that's one thing. The other thing that you mentioned, you know, going back to the office, is COVID has changed people in not just how they work, but how they feel about work.
Mhm.
Because there are some people now, because they were working from home, they're seeing their partners more, their children more. They're not having an hour or 2 hours of commute both ways. So they're spending more time with family. And I think organizations now have to also think that sometimes these people don't want to come back to the office. They are actually doing better by working from home. They feel better. Their wellness, their mental well-being is changing. You know, and it's different for others who may be isolated and quarantined at home that are just chomping at the bit to get back to the office because they're more extroverted and they need that interaction. They need that water cooler conversations. They need, you know, they don't mind the interruptions, you know, and the conversations and things like that. So it's really changed a lot of how people are going to be working and what organizations need to think. We can't just assume now COVID is, quote, over, everyone back to the office. That may not be the case now. You know, it's going to be very different. And I was talking to somebody, um, a past colleague, actually a little while ago, and he was telling me the story of he was talking with his vice president, and they were talking about an employee who wasn't doing that great, let's say, you know, before COVID in the office. And, you know, they were kind of wondering what might we do with this person? COVID hit, the person's working from home and they are excelling. They're doing a fantastic job working at home. And the vice president was just, it said it was like night and day, you know. So what are you going to do with that person? You're going to make them go back to the office? Are you going to make them fail now? So, you know, there's a lot of different ways to think, I think, in the next few months, and what organizations. I don't think we can just flip a switch and say everyone back to the office.
Yes, especially in those open offices where everybody's at a desk, and I'm a tall person and my head and shoulders are above looking around like a giraffe. Very uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. But second of all, the two things that I think of as I heard you talk about that, the way we communicate, our communication plan now has to adjust. It's very different if we're all sitting in the same room and there's a fire or whatever versus, you know, now we're all dispersed. And second of all, my bias, I'm admitting this bias publicly, is I think it's always a great idea for people to have hard copies of their business continuity plan. You never can trust that mobile networks will be up during an event or that you'll have power or whatever. And so I like having hard copies, at least for your strategic people, that they can put it in their hands and they know what to do. But now this means all those strategic people in those BC plans have to have hard copies, right? I mean,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. It's I, I like the idea of always having a hard copy somewhere.
right.
You know, yes, you may have different copies on different systems or on hard drives or USB keys or stored offsite or whatever, but nothing beats the old-fashioned hard copy somewhere. You know, you've got to have a couple that people know where they are, and strategic, you know, key people have to have that. I think they really, I think they should have that. I still do for things. It's like, no, that one I need a hard copy for, because if I ever lose the email or whatever, I'm in a mess.
Right. I mentioned about living in the land of tornadoes. Tornadoes come through, you have no mobile networks, you have no power. Now what? Right? Now
Yeah.
what? And so how do you get in touch with people? You can't say, okay, they're number 7 on my speed dial. That doesn't work. And so you got to figure it out.
Yep.
Alex, I've enjoyed this conversation. It's been great. And I thank you for your time. How can people get in touch with you?
Oh, there's lots of ways of finding me. Obviously, you can go to the YouTube channel, Prepare for the Unexpected, leave a comment. You can reach me that way. You can go to voiceamerica.com and the show, Preparing for the Unexpected. There is a button underneath the graphic. You can send me an email that way. You can reach me there. You can reach me on my company website, www.stone-road.com, stone-road.com, or you can even go to alexfullick.com. And if none of those interest you, you can always find me on LinkedIn. I am the only Alex Fullick on LinkedIn. So if you can't find me there, you're spelling it wrong, because I'm there and I'm the only one there. And I do
great.
respond. I do respond to everything I get, no matter where it comes from. Unless it's a sales pitch, then I just kind of delete. But otherwise, I respond to everything.
And I appreciate your internet radio podcast is great. It dives into many of the very tactical and operational and strategic topics within business continuity, crisis management. And so I appreciate having you on here, and I appreciate being on your podcast when I wrote my business continuity book. And it, just talks about some of these same topics. But I think the biggest thing is the experience you bring and the ability to say, this is how we've evolved. This is what we're doing, how we're doing it a little different than the past. And there's no substitute for experience, is there?
No, you got to get your hands and feet dirty. Doing internet searches and reading an article or a standard isn't going to cut it for you. You really got to get in the trenches and learn it the hard way by doing.
Especially since there's no standard. That's what I was getting at earlier, is there's no prescriptive way. And so you have to find people that are willing to understand your business. I'm talking to big companies, small companies, organizations, government agencies, whomever. Have to have somebody that can understand your business and develop a plan based upon what you need. Because as Alex mentioned earlier, some of what is normally considered what you need may not be what you need, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you got to meet the client, the organization, where they are, and start from there. And then they will be happy. You'll get them what they need. You'll have all the buy-in you want. They will be on your side, and you can facilitate it and make them successful.
And that's what it's all about. It's kind of like I have a couple of teenagers. Everybody's like, you all are pretty good parents. I'm like, no, I don't want to hear that. The real test is when they leave the house. So your BC plans, it doesn't matter how good you think they are. The true evaluation of how good they are is when an event occurs.
Yeah,
then right. And they don't know who the tall, ugly guy with glasses is. And can they execute? And if the answer is yes, then I've done a good job. You've done a good job. If not, maybe we need to go back through the training aspects a little more, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, Alex, thank you for joining me on our podcast, the Service Management Leadership Podcast. Thank you for giving us your time and your experience.
My pleasure.
Have a great day.
You too, and stay safe.
Thank you.